Imagine walking down a quiet street at night, only to be seen as a threat because of the color of your skin. It sounds outrageous, doesn't it? But this is the harsh reality for countless black men across the country. People like John Bradley, a man who served his country with honor, only to be brutally attacked by the very system he once defended. What the officer who nearly took John's life didn't know was that John's son is no ordinary man. Marcus Bradley, a rising federal judge, is about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. What happens when the system's worst enemy is the one person trained to expose its deepest flaws? But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. John Bradley, a man who had already witnessed the worst of humanity on the battlefield, was now facing a different kind of war. In a small town in the southern United States, where racial tensions still ran deep like a silent poison, he struggled to readjust to civilian life. The weight of discrimination hung in the air at every corner, in every glance he received while walking down the streets. Despite being a war veteran, the respect he had earned was not enough to erase the color of his skin. In that society marked by inequality, his service to the country was often forgotten, overshadowed by the prejudice that refused to fade away with time. His son, Marcus Bradley, was the pride of the family, a rising federal judge who had built his career on ethics and perseverance, determined to fight injustice wherever it lurked. He saw in his father a model of courage and faith, qualities that had guided him throughout his life. Marcus often said that John's resilience, his ability to overcome the most devastating challenges, was what inspired him to stand up for the marginalized. Yet, even with all his determination, Marcus knew that the battle against racism was long, difficult, and often fought in silence. The bond between father and son was strong, solidified by each new obstacle they faced together. The small town they lived in, however, did not share the same admiration for their achievements. In a place where racist traditions were still passed down through generations, Marcus's rise to such an important position was viewed with suspicion by many. There was a veiled resentment, a sense that people like him didn't belong in such places of power. Yet, Marcus held his head high, knowing that to many, he represented hope. The hope that the system could one day be more just. The hope that through perseverance, future generations wouldn't have to face the same hatred he and his father had known so well. John, on the other hand, had a more pragmatic view of life. After so many battles, he had learned that the world didn't change easily. For him, personal resilience was his only weapon against a society that viewed him as lesser. His nightly walks were a time for reflection, a way to cope with the weight of war memories and the everyday challenges. He recalled nights on the battlefield where courage was the only thing standing between him and death. Now, in this seemingly peaceful town, he faced a different fight, a battle against invisibility, against a society that preferred to ignore his achievements. To many, John was just another ordinary man walking the streets at night. But to those who knew him, he was a silent hero, someone who carried the pain of generations, yet also the hope for a better future. His unwavering faith kept him standing, even on the hardest days, and his love for his family was what motivated him to keep fighting. He believed that, despite everything, there was still room for compassion in the world. But, like so many others before him, he knew that the road to justice was long and filled with obstacles. The town's social context was steeped in a quiet tension. Racial interactions, though cordial on the surface, bore the weight of centuries of segregation and inequality. There were neighborhoods where African Americans were not welcome after sunset, and the local police often acted as enforcers of this invisible oppression. John knew this, which is why he always kept a low profile, trying not to draw attention to himself. He believed that with patience and perseverance, he could live in peace, even in a society that still viewed him as an other. But deep down, he knew the fight had never ended. It had just changed form. In the eyes of many, John was just another man, a black man trying to survive in a world not made for him. But to those who knew him well, he was more than that. He was a man who had faced down unimaginable horrors, both on the battlefield and at home. For John, life was not about seeking recognition, but about surviving with dignity, regardless of how the world chose to view him. Every evening when he walked the quiet streets, he carried the silent burden of past traumas, but also a flicker of hope for the future, believing that, one day, the world might be different. Marcus, on the other hand, was always on the move. His work as a federal judge required him to stay firm, even in the face of political and social pressures. He knew that, to many, his presence in the courtroom was an anomaly, something that challenged the status quo. But to him, this was a source of pride. He believed that each case he judged was an opportunity to make a difference, to expose the injustices that were deeply rooted in the system. And each victory in court was a small victory against the prejudice that his family had faced for generations. Despite their differences in age and perspective, John and Marcus shared one thing in common: the determination never to be broken by racism. They knew that in such a divided society, every step toward equality was a battle in itself. For John, it meant living his life with dignity, even when others tried to take it away. For Marcus, it meant using his position of power to fight the injustices that his father and so many other African Americans faced daily. Together, they formed an unstoppable force, driven by faith, courage, and a deep love for justice. As Marcus dealt with the challenges of his job, John faced the challenges of daily life. He knew that, to many, he was just another black man trying to make his way in a world that wasn't built for him. But in his heart, he carried the conviction that his life had a greater purpose. He believed that in some way, his daily struggles were paving the way for a future generation that wouldn't have to fight as hard. And it was that hope that kept him going, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. In that southern town, the lives of John and Marcus reflected the struggles of so many other African Americans throughout history. They lived in a world where courage and faith were essential to overcome the daily challenges. But despite everything, they never lost hope that, one day, things could change. To them, overcoming wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. They knew that the road to justice was long and arduous, but they also knew that with perseverance and love, anything was possible. And so, as John walked the streets of the town at night, he carried with him not only the weight of his own experiences, but also the hope for a better future. He knew that despite all the difficulties, there was still room for compassion in the world. And as he walked, reflecting on his life and struggles, he had no idea that this night would mark a turning point, a twist that would forever change the course of his story and his family's. It was a quiet night, the kind where the streets were deserted, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. John Bradley, as usual, decided to go for his evening walk, a moment he used to clear his mind and reflect. The moon hung low in the sky, casting soft shadows along the pavement. And for John, this was a moment of peace amidst the chaos of daily life. He wore his usual calm demeanor, unaware that this night would be anything but ordinary. As he made his way back home, the peace was suddenly shattered by the sight of police lights flashing ahead. He slowed his pace, not out of fear, but out of caution, a habit formed by years of living in a world where being a black man at night could draw unwanted attention. Officer Jake Henderson was patrolling the area that evening, though patrolling was perhaps a generous term for what he was doing. Henderson was known for his aggressive, confrontational behavior, particularly toward the town's black residents. He had a reputation for using his badge as a means of control rather than protection. When he spotted John, a black man walking alone at night, his mind immediately jumped to conclusions. Without hesitation, he turned his patrol car toward John, the red and blue lights bathing the street in a surreal glow. "What are you doing out here at this time of night?" Henderson's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and accusatory. John paused, not out of fear, but out of a mix of frustration and weariness. He had dealt with men like Henderson before, men who saw skin color as a threat rather than character. John remained calm, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse. "Just heading home," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm a veteran, sir. I live just down the street." He hoped mentioning his military service would diffuse the situation, that the officer would recognize him as someone who had served his country. But to Henderson, none of that mattered. He wasn't interested in who John was or what he had done for the nation. In his eyes, John was simply another black man who didn't belong on those streets after dark. Henderson's hand instinctively moved to his holster as he stepped closer, his posture aggressive, as if John had already committed a crime simply by existing. "You look suspicious," he said, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the air grew thicker, and John could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Decades of racial profiling, of black men being accused of crimes they didn't commit. He had been through wars, seen men die, and faced enemies far more dangerous than this, but there was something different about facing this kind of threat on home soil. His courage never wavered, but the injustice of the moment hung heavily in the air. John took a deep breath. "I'm not a threat," he said quietly, his hands slightly raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm just going home." But Henderson was beyond listening. In his mind, John was guilty of something, and no amount of reasoning would change that. The officer's grip tightened on his weapon, his eyes filled with a hatred that John had seen too many times before. Without warning, Henderson lunged forward, grabbing John's arm with unnecessary force. "Don't move," he barked, shoving John against the hood of his car. The situation escalated quickly, the peaceful evening turning into a scene of violence, driven by deep-rooted racism and unchecked authority. John struggled to understand why this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, a veteran of the United States, being treated like a criminal in the country he had served. The blows came fast and hard. Henderson's fists pounded into John's body with a brutality that seemed endless. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't the physical hurt that shocked John the most. It was the sheer hatred in Henderson's actions, the way he dehumanized him with every strike. John tried to call out, to reason with the man, but his words were drowned out by the sound of his own labored breathing. As John's vision blurred, the world around him started to fade. He could hear distant voices, perhaps neighbors watching from behind closed doors, too afraid to intervene. Each punch felt like a reminder of the systemic racism that still poisoned his country. His body gave in, collapsing under the weight of the assault. But in his mind, he was still standing tall. The sense of injustice was overwhelming. And yet, in those final moments of consciousness, John thought not of himself, but of Marcus, his son, the man who had devoted his life to justice, would soon have to face the reality of this brutal world in the most personal way possible. Henderson finally stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion, his knuckles raw from the attack. John lay motionless on the ground, barely breathing. For a moment, there was silence. Henderson looked down at him, the flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But then, as if to justify his actions, he spat on the ground beside John's body. "Should have stayed home," he muttered before turning back to his patrol car. The red and blue lights still flashed, but now they illuminated a scene of horrific violence, a reminder that for some, justice was still an illusion. As John lay there, slipping into unconsciousness, the reality of the situation settled in. He had survived war zones, only to be beaten down in his own neighborhood. The cruel irony of it all was almost too much to bear. In the distance, the faint sound of an ambulance siren broke the silence, but John was already slipping away into darkness. He didn't know if he would wake up, if he would see his son again, or if this would be the end of his story. But somewhere, deep inside, hope flickered, a hope that, no matter what happened to him, Marcus would find the strength to seek justice. The aftermath of the encounter left the street empty, save for John's broken body and the cold wind that swept through the night. It was a scene all too familiar to those who had lived through similar injustices. Another black man beaten, another act of violence justified by fear and hatred. But John's story wouldn't end here, not yet. His survival, though uncertain, would become the catalyst for a battle much larger than just one man. This was about a system, a history, and the courage it would take to change both. The news of John Bradley's brutal beating spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, whispers filled the streets, and the story grew more tragic with every retelling. Those who knew John couldn't believe it. How could a man like him, kind, honorable, a war veteran, be left in such a state? His neighbors, the ones who had seen him on his daily walks, were in shock. John? That can't be right, they'd say. He was a man of integrity, a peaceful soul who had given so much for his country. The thought of him being attacked, beaten by someone sworn to protect, left the community reeling. But not everyone shared the same outrage. In some corners of town, where old prejudices still lingered, people found ways to justify what had happened. He must have been up to something, some said. It was easier for them to believe that John, an innocent man, had somehow provoked the violence than to face the reality that a black man could be brutalized for simply existing. This division was nothing new. The town had always harbored an undercurrent of racial tension, and John's attack only brought those feelings to the surface. It was a reminder that, for some, the color of a man's skin was still seen as justification for suspicion and violence. As John lay in a hospital bed, unconscious and fighting for his life, his son Marcus received the devastating call. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Your father. He's in a coma." Marcus's world stopped. He had dedicated his life to fighting injustice, to upholding the law, and now his own father had become the latest victim of the very thing he had spent years trying to eradicate. The rage he felt was almost unbearable, but underneath it all was a deep sadness, a sense of helplessness that he hadn't felt in years. Marcus knew that he had to act, but this was more than just a professional challenge. It was personal, and it cut deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. The town's black community rallied behind Marcus and his family. They saw in John's story their own struggles, their own pain. For them, this wasn't just about one man. It was about the systemic racism they had all faced in one form or another. People gathered outside the hospital, praying for John's recovery, holding vigils, and demanding justice. The church, the heart of the black community, became a center of activity, with leaders calling for calm, but also for action. "We've seen this too many times," said Reverend James, a longtime activist. "This is a fight for justice, for all of us." There was a sense of collective grief, but also a fierce determination to make sure that John's story would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, Marcus wasted no time. He was a man of action, and though his heart ached, he knew he had to stay focused. He immediately contacted the district attorney's office, demanding that the officer responsible for his father's beating be investigated and charged. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew how these things worked. Too often, cases like his father's were swept under the rug, buried in bureaucratic red tape, or justified through legal loopholes. He had seen it happen before, but this time, it was different. This time, he was going to make sure that justice was served, no matter how long it took. As Marcus dove into the case, the media quickly caught wind of the story. News outlets began to cover John's attack, drawing national attention to the small town. Reporters camped outside the hospital, and soon, John Bradley's name was on everyone's lips. The image of an honorable veteran, beaten within an inch of his life by a police officer, struck a chord with people across the country. It was a story that echoed the brutal realities faced by many African Americans, and it sparked conversations about race, police brutality, and the need for systemic change. Protests began to form, not just in the town, but in cities across the nation. The town itself became a battleground for these issues. On one side, there were those who supported John and his family, demanding that Officer Henderson be held accountable. On the other side were those who defended the police, believing that Henderson had acted in self-defense, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. Tensions ran high, and the town felt like it was on the brink of something dangerous. The streets that John had once walked in peace were now filled with protesters, shouting for justice, while others quietly murmured that things were getting out of control. Marcus, despite his personal pain, had to remain calm and focused. He knew that this wasn't just about his father. It was about something much larger. As he watched the growing unrest, he felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride because so many people were standing up for his father and what he represented. Sadness because it took something so tragic to ignite this kind of action. His phone rang constantly, reporters, lawyers, activists, all wanting to speak with him to get his perspective. But for Marcus, there was only one focus: justice. He would not rest until Officer Henderson was held accountable for what he had done. At the same time, Marcus struggled with the emotional toll of seeing his father in such a vulnerable state. Each day, he visited the hospital, sitting by John's bedside, hoping for some sign of improvement. He would talk to his father, telling him about the fight that was happening outside, about the people rallying for him. "We're going to get justice, Dad," he would whisper, his voice breaking under the weight of his emotions. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." But deep down, Marcus knew that even if they won the legal battle, nothing could undo the damage that had been done. As days turned into weeks, the investigation into Officer Henderson's actions began. Marcus had expected resistance, and he wasn't wrong. The local police department was quick to circle the wagons, trying to protect one of their own. They painted John as the aggressor, claiming that Henderson had feared for his life. But Marcus was prepared. He had gathered a team of lawyers, investigators, and activists who were just as determined as he was to expose the truth. And the truth was clear. Henderson had attacked an innocent man, driven by prejudice and hatred. The media continued to follow the case, and with each new development, the pressure on the town's authorities grew. The community's division deepened. Some people began to openly question the integrity of the police force, while others stood firm in their belief that the officer had been justified. It was a microcosm of the larger national debate about race and policing, and it was playing out in real time, with John Bradley's life hanging in the balance. Every new headline, every protest sign, every speech given by community leaders added another layer to the already complex situation. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast. His faith in the justice system had been shaken, but not broken. He believed that with enough perseverance, they could overcome the obstacles in their way. He thought about his father, the man who had taught him the value of courage and compassion. And he thought about all the people who were counting on him to lead this fight. It wasn't just about John anymore. It was about every black man, woman, and child who had ever faced the same injustice. Marcus knew that their battle was far from over, but he was ready to fight. Marcus Bradley wasn't the type of man to sit idly by while injustice unfolded. The moment he heard about his father's brutal assault, something ignited within him, a fierce determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As a federal judge, Marcus had spent years navigating the complexities of the legal system, fighting corruption, and standing against oppression. But this time, the battle wasn't just another case. It was personal. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, not only as a son, but as a black man in a country where his father's story was all too common. Marcus knew that if he didn't act, his father's beating would become just another statistic, another story lost in the noise. The first step in his investigation was to gather information on Officer Jake Henderson. Marcus had heard of Henderson before. His reputation as a violent, aggressive officer wasn't a secret. In fact, Henderson had a history of using excessive force, especially against black citizens, but nothing had ever been done. The police department had always found ways to protect him, to cover up his behavior with excuses about following protocol or self-defense. But Marcus knew better. He had seen these types of cases before. Officers who abused their power, knowing that the system was designed to protect them rather than hold them accountable. But this time, Marcus was determined to break that cycle. As Marcus dug deeper, he discovered a pattern. Henderson had been involved in several questionable incidents, all involving black men. And in each case, the charges had either been dropped or the victims had been silenced through intimidation. Marcus realized that he wasn't just dealing with one rogue officer. He was up against a system that had allowed men like Henderson to operate unchecked for years. It was a web of corruption and racism that ran deep, and Marcus knew that unraveling it would be no easy task. Still, his resolve only grew stronger. This time, he thought to himself, they won't get away with it. But as Marcus continued his investigation, he encountered obstacles at every turn. The police department was uncooperative, refusing to release critical information about Henderson's past incidents. Requests for body cam footage were met with delays, and key witnesses were suddenly reluctant to speak. It became clear that the department was closing ranks, doing everything in its power to protect one of its own. This wasn't just about Jake Henderson anymore. It was about a culture of silence and complicity within the force. Marcus was furious, but he wasn't surprised. He had seen it before in his work as a judge, the way institutions could twist and turn to protect their own. One night, while poring over documents in his office, Marcus received a call from a former police officer who had worked with Henderson. The man, speaking in hushed tones, revealed that Henderson had a long history of racist behavior, even within the department. "They all know what he's like," the officer said, "but no one's willing to do anything about it." This wasn't new information to Marcus, but hearing it from someone on the inside gave him hope. There were cracks in the system, people who were willing to speak out if given the chance. Marcus knew that he would need to build a coalition of allies, people who believed in justice and were willing to stand up, even if it meant going against the institution. Despite these breakthroughs, the challenges mounted. Local officials, many of whom had close ties to the police department, began to pressure Marcus to back down. "You're too close to this case," they told him. "Let someone else handle it." But Marcus knew what that meant. He had seen too many cases fall through the cracks when the people in power wanted to protect their own. He couldn't trust anyone else to handle it with the same level of urgency, the same passion for justice. So he pressed on, knowing full well that every move he made was being watched, every step met with resistance from those who wanted to keep the status quo intact. As Marcus's investigation gained momentum, the town's racial tensions began to flare. Protests erupted outside the police station, demanding that Henderson be held accountable, while counter-protesters lined the streets, defending the officer's actions. The town was a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. His father was still in a coma, and the man responsible for it was walking free, protected by the very system Marcus had dedicated his life to upholding. The irony was almost unbearable, but he knew that he had no choice but to keep going. His father's life and the lives of countless others depended on it. Throughout the investigation, Marcus was forced to confront his own internal conflict. As a judge, he had always prided himself on his objectivity, his ability to see the facts and remain detached. But this case was different. The lines between his personal and professional life had blurred, and he found himself struggling to maintain his composure. Every time he looked at a photo of his father lying in that hospital bed, the anger bubbled up again, threatening to consume him. But Marcus knew that anger alone wouldn't win this fight. He needed to be smart, strategic. He needed to channel his rage into something constructive, something that would lead to real change. As the weeks went by, Marcus's investigation began to uncover more damning evidence. Old police reports that had been conveniently buried came to light, detailing incidents where Henderson had used excessive force but had been cleared of any wrongdoing. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak up were now coming forward, emboldened by Marcus's determination. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Henderson's actions were part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. They were getting closer to the truth, but there was still so much work to be done. The pressure on Marcus intensified as the investigation drew national attention. Reporters hounded him for interviews, and his every move was scrutinized by both supporters and detractors. Some hailed him as a hero, a man standing up against a corrupt system, while others accused him of using his position for personal revenge. But Marcus didn't care about the headlines. His focus was on one thing: justice. He knew that his father, a man of honor and integrity, deserved more than to be reduced to a symbol of brutality. He deserved to be remembered as the hero he was, not as a victim. But as Marcus delved deeper into the case, he began to realize that the fight for justice wasn't just about taking down Henderson. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed men like Henderson to thrive. The corruption ran deep, and Marcus knew that even if they succeeded in prosecuting the officer, it wouldn't be enough. Real change would require a complete overhaul of the way the police department operated, a reckoning with the racism that had been ingrained in its culture for decades. Marcus wasn't sure how to make that happen, but he knew he had to try. In the midst of all this, Marcus found himself reflecting on the lessons his father had taught him growing up. John had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. Marcus could hear his father's voice in his head, reminding him to stay the course, to never give up in the face of adversity. It was that voice that kept him going, even when the road seemed impossibly long. Marcus knew that his father would want him to fight, not just for justice in this case, but for the future of their community, for a world where no one had to live in fear of the people meant to protect them. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Officer Jake Henderson's trial. The tension in the air was palpable, as the eyes of the town and the nation were fixed on this one case. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready to capture every moment, every reaction. Marcus Bradley, though not directly involved in the prosecution, was present, watching from the gallery. He had to remain composed, even though his heart was racing with a mixture of anger and grief. His father was still lying in a hospital bed, and the man responsible sat calmly at the defense table, as if he hadn't nearly taken a life. It was surreal, and yet this was the reality they were living in. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the facts. They presented John Bradley's impeccable military record, his status as a respected member of the community, and the brutal attack that had left him fighting for his life. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for being tough on police misconduct, was determined to prove that Henderson had overstepped his authority. "This is not about an officer doing his job," she said in her opening statement. "This is about an abuse of power. A man who let his prejudice guide his actions, with tragic results." Her words struck a chord with the jury, many of whom seemed visibly moved by the gravity of the situation. Henderson's defense team, however, was equally prepared. They argued that the officer had acted in self-defense, claiming that John Bradley had resisted arrest and posed a threat. "My client feared for his life," the defense attorney said, painting a picture of Henderson as a man who had been forced to make a difficult split-second decision. It was a narrative that Marcus had expected, but hearing it out loud still made his blood boil. He knew his father. John wasn't a threat. He was a man who had served his country with honor. But here he was being portrayed as a dangerous criminal because of the color of his skin. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battlefield of conflicting narratives. The defense brought in witnesses, fellow officers who testified to Henderson's character, describing him as a dedicated cop who had simply been doing his job. But Marcus knew the truth. He had uncovered the officer's history of violent behavior, his pattern of targeting black men. Yet, as each officer took the stand, it was clear that the police department was circling the wagons, protecting their own. "He's a good cop," they said over and over, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But Marcus saw the cracks in their stories, the inconsistencies that would be their downfall. The most crucial piece of evidence came when the prosecution presented the surveillance footage from the night of the attack. The video was grainy, but the violence was unmistakable. There, on the screen, was Jake Henderson beating John Bradley with a level of force that was both unnecessary and horrifying. Gasps filled the courtroom as the footage played. Marcus kept his eyes on the jury, watching their reactions. He could see the shock, the disbelief, as they witnessed the brutality for themselves. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. Henderson's defense team tried to discredit the footage, claiming that the angle didn't capture the full context of the situation. "You can't see what happened before," they argued, insisting that Henderson had felt threatened and was simply protecting himself. But the damage had been done. The image of Henderson beating an unarmed man was burned into the minds of everyone in that courtroom. It was a turning point in the trial, and Marcus could feel the shift in momentum. For the first time, he allowed himself a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. Throughout the trial, the town remained on edge. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, holding signs and chanting for justice. "No justice, no peace," echoed through the streets as tensions between the community and the police reached a boiling point. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally charged. Every witness, every piece of evidence, felt like a small victory or defeat in a larger war. Marcus watched it all unfold, his emotions tightly controlled. But inside, he was a storm of anger, sadness, and determination. He knew that this case was about more than just his father. It was about the countless other victims of police violence who had never gotten their day in court. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides gave their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury of the evidence. The video, the witnesses, the pattern of violence that Jake Henderson had exhibited throughout his career. "This is not a case of self-defense," the prosecutor said firmly. "This is a case of an officer abusing his power, using violence when it wasn't necessary, and leaving a man in a coma because of it." Marcus watched the jurors closely as the words sank in. He could see the weight of the decision they had to make reflected in their expressions. The defense, on the other hand, doubled down on their narrative. They insisted that Henderson had followed protocol, that he had no choice but to act the way he did. No one wants to believe that a police officer could make a mistake, the defense attorney said. But we must give him the benefit of the doubt. He was afraid for his life. It was a desperate attempt to sway the jury, but Marcus could tell that the tide had turned. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jurors knew it. Still, until the verdict was read, Marcus couldn't allow himself to fully believe that they would win. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. Every eye was on the judge as he asked the foreman to deliver the verdict. Marcus sat at the edge of his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Henderson, guilty of aggravated assault." The words echoed in the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was bittersweet. His father was still in a coma, and no verdict could change that. But at least for once, the system had worked. At least, for once, a black man's life had been valued in a court of law. As the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps, Marcus remained seated, his hands trembling slightly. He had fought so hard for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he wasn't sure what to feel. There was no joy in seeing a man convicted, only a sense of justice finally being served. Outside, the protesters celebrated the verdict, but Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. His father's condition remained unchanged, and the wounds inflicted on the community would take much longer to heal. This was just one victory in a much larger battle, one that would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. Despite the guilty verdict, Marcus knew that there was still work to be done. The trial had exposed the deep-rooted problems within the police department, but real change would require more than just one conviction. It would require a complete overhaul of the system, a reckoning with the racism that had been allowed to fester for so long. As Marcus left the courthouse that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His father had always taught him that courage meant standing up even when the odds were against you. And that's exactly what Marcus intended to do. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was just beginning. The moment the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, the weight of weeks of tension seemed to lift for a brief moment. But for Marcus Bradley, the verdict brought little solace. Yes, justice had been served in the legal sense, but his father was still in a coma, his life hanging in the balance. The jury's decision was a victory, but it felt hollow. As the crowd outside the courthouse erupted into a mixture of cheers and applause, Marcus remained seated, his thoughts heavy with the reality of what still lay ahead. The trial had ended, but the damage it had caused, to his family, to the town, and to the fragile fabric of society, was far from healed. John Bradley's condition had not improved, and the doctors were unsure if he would ever wake up. Each day, Marcus sat by his father's bedside, watching the machines that kept him alive, hoping for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing day. The man who had raised him, taught him about perseverance and courage, now lay motionless, unable to see the justice that had been fought for in his name. It was a cruel irony. Marcus had spent his entire career fighting for justice, but nothing could prepare him for the emotional toll of nearly losing his father to the very system he had sworn to uphold. The city, once quiet, was now a place of unrest. The trial had brought to light the deep racial divides that had always simmered beneath the surface. For some, Henderson's conviction was seen as a step toward accountability, a rare moment when a police officer was held responsible for his actions. But for others, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Protesters from both sides clashed in the streets, each group holding signs that reflected their deeply held beliefs. Justice for John banners were met with chants of "Support our police," and the air was thick with tension. The town, much like Marcus, was left grappling with the aftermath of the trial. For the black community, the verdict represented a glimmer of hope. It was a rare instance where the system had worked in their favor, where a black man's life had been valued in the eyes of the law. But that victory was tempered by the knowledge that John was still in a coma, his fate uncertain. Community leaders called for peace, urging their followers to channel their energy into positive change. "This isn't the end," Reverend James declared at a vigil held outside the courthouse. "This is just the beginning. We've won a battle, but the war for equality is far from over." His words resonated deeply with those who had seen too many injustices go unpunished. For Marcus, the days following the verdict were a blur of conflicting emotions. He had fought so hard to bring Henderson to justice, but now that the trial was over, he was left with a sense of emptiness. The legal battle had consumed him, and now, without it to focus on, the full weight of his father's condition hit him like a wave. He wondered if he had done enough, if justice was truly served when the man responsible for his father's condition would serve time, but his father might never wake up. It was a question that haunted him, one he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. As the town continued to grapple with the fallout of the trial, the police department faced increased scrutiny. Henderson's conviction had sparked calls for reform, and local activists demanded accountability from the top down. Investigations were launched into the department's practices, and several high-ranking officers were placed on leave pending the outcome. It was clear that Henderson wasn't the only problem. The system itself was broken, and fixing it would require more than just firing a few bad actors. Marcus watched the news reports with a sense of cautious optimism. Change was coming, but he knew it wouldn't be easy or quick. Despite the unrest in the town, Marcus found moments of peace in the quiet of his father's hospital room. It was there, sitting by John's side, that Marcus reflected on everything they had been through. His father had always believed in the power of perseverance, that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way forward. Marcus clung to that belief, even as the days stretched on without any sign of improvement. He thought about the countless families who had lost loved ones to violence, who never got the chance to see justice served. He knew that in some ways, they were lucky. At least Henderson had been held accountable. But even as Marcus tried to find solace in the legal victory, the weight of the city's unrest bore down on him. The protests showed no sign of stopping, and tensions between the police and the black community were higher than ever. There were calls for defunding the police, for dismantling a system that many saw as inherently racist and corrupt. Marcus understood their anger, but he also knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to rebuild trust, something that seemed almost impossible in the current climate. The road to healing, both for the city and for himself, was long and uncertain. The national spotlight remained on the town as the media continued to cover the story. Experts debated the implications of Henderson's conviction, while activists used the case as a rallying cry for broader police reform. Marcus, who had once thrived in the public eye as a judge, now found himself wanting to retreat from the attention. He didn't want his father's name to become a symbol, a tool for others to use in their own agendas. John was more than just a victim. He was a man of integrity, a veteran who had given his life to serving others. Marcus feared that in all the noise, people would forget who his father really was. Even as the country debated the case, Marcus's focus remained on his father. He visited the hospital daily, hoping for some sign of improvement. The doctors told him that the chances of John waking up were slim, but Marcus refused to give up hope. His father had survived worse war, racism, and hardship. Surely he could survive this too. It was that hope that kept Marcus going, even when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm him. "You're a fighter, Dad," he would say quietly, holding his father's hand. "You've always been a fighter. Don't give up now." As the weeks passed, the town slowly began to calm down. The protests died down, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the scars remained. For Marcus, the trial had been a victory, but it hadn't brought the closure he had hoped for. His father's condition was unchanged, and the town was still grappling with the deep-seated issues that had been brought to light. There was a sense that things would never quite be the same again. The trial had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, and while some embraced the need for change, others resisted it with all their might. In the end, the verdict was just one chapter in a much larger story. Marcus knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, and that the work was far from over. His father's attack had exposed the cracks in the system, but fixing them would take time and dedication. As he sat in the quiet of his father's hospital room, Marcus made a promise to himself. He would continue the fight, not just for his father, but for every person who had ever been denied justice. The road ahead was long, but with perseverance, faith, and the memory of his father's courage, Marcus knew they could make it through. Now that you've seen the depths of this story, I have to ask, what will you do with it? Will this just be another story that passes by, or will it ignite something in you? The truth is, we're all part of this system, whether we choose to act or remain silent. John's story could have ended with just another name lost to violence, but it didn't. It sparked a movement, a fight for justice that resonates with all of us. What about you? What battles are you facing that seem impossible to win? What injustices are you seeing that you could stand up against? This story isn't just about a man and his family. It's about perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about courage, faith, and the will to keep going when the world feels against you. Now, ask yourself, are you ready to take a stand? Are you ready to challenge the systems that hold you back or make others suffer? Maybe your fight isn't in a courtroom, but it's just as important. Whatever it is, remember that real change starts with you. What steps will you take today to make sure your voice is heard? If you're as passionate about justice and change as we are, make sure you don't miss out on more stories like this. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us in this journey toward a better world. There's more to learn, more to fight for, and more stories of courage and revelation that you need to hear. Together, we can make a difference. So, are you with us? Let's continue this fight, one story at a time.